I've always believed that I knew everything about my family. My son, Chris, was a typical teenager, quiet, often in his room, playing games or studying. But lately, something had changed. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt a strange distance between us. I remember thinking, is he growing up, or is there something more? At times, his moods were unpredictable. He'd be fine one moment, then suddenly withdrawn, lost in his thoughts. It wasn't just him. I couldn't help but notice the little things, like how my husband seemed more distracted than usual. It started with the late nights, the phone calls that went unanswered when I asked who was calling. I told myself it was nothing, just a phase. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The unease in my heart grew. I tried to brush it off. After all, we all have our secrets. But Chris's behavior didn't sit well with me. There were whispers of a secret life, things I never asked about, things I didn't understand. I always thought that as a parent I was supposed to know my child completely. But the more I observed him, the more he felt like a stranger to me. He'd leave for hours without explanation, and sometimes I'd find him with his headphones on, blocking the world out. I tried to connect with him, asking about his day, what was on his mind, but the conversations felt hollow, like he wasn't entirely there. Something was off, and I could feel it eating away at me. Then there was the other nagging issue, my husband. I'd catch him leaving the house more often, his phone pinging with notifications at odd hours. He'd snap at me if I asked too many questions, brushing it off with excuses I no longer found convincing. I started noticing how we avoided eye contact. There were moments when the silence between us felt too thick to ignore. Was he hiding something from me? I thought about the possibilities. Could he be seeing someone else? Maybe I was just being paranoid, but a part of me was beginning to believe that infidelity was the explanation for the distance in our marriage. Despite all the tension, I never expected to find what I did one evening. Chris had gone out, and I decided to check on some things in his room, just a routine glance to see if he was keeping up with his responsibilities. I wasn't prepared for what I found. There, on his computer screen, was a video. At first, I didn't understand it. He was dancing. But it wasn't just any dance. It was intense, beautiful even, and filled with raw emotion. It wasn't something I would have ever expected from him. He'd always been the quiet, reserved type, never showing much interest in anything artistic. Yet there he was, moving with a kind of freedom I never knew he had. I was mesmerized by the fluidity of his movements, the way his body seemed to express everything he couldn't say with words. The discovery sent a chill through me. It was more than just a hobby, there was a depth to it. I couldn't comprehend it at first. What was this? Why had he kept this from me? It wasn't just about the dance. It was about the hidden side of him that I never knew existed. I felt like I was peering into a part of his soul that he'd locked away from me. I was torn between shock and awe, but most of all I was hurt. Why hadn't he shared this with me? Was I so distant that he didn't feel he could? As much as I was captivated by the beauty of his movements, I couldn't ignore the feeling of betrayal that lingered. It was as if he'd been living a secret life right under my nose, and I hadn't even noticed. What struck me most was how it reminded me of my own marriage, of the secrets my husband was hiding. Chris had built a hidden world, one where he could express himself freely, but I wondered if that was a reflection of the emotional walls in our family. The parallels were too strong to ignore. Just as I felt estranged from my husband, Chris seemed to be shutting me out, building his own life behind closed doors. I wanted to understand it, to reach out and ask him about it, but the fear of pushing him further away kept me frozen. Maybe I was afraid of what I might uncover, not just about my son, but about myself. How much had I missed while thinking everything was fine? It seemed like the more I looked, the more secrets I found, hidden layers of my family that I never thought to explore. I had to know more. I couldn't just sit there, paralyzed by uncertainty. My mind raced with questions. Was this a phase? Was he hiding something more than just his love for dance? The curiosity gnawed at me. But there was something else too, something darker. A sense of betrayal that mirrored my own suspicions about my husband. Chris's secret was almost like a reflection of my own emotional distance from my spouse. We were all hiding something, keeping parts of ourselves locked away from each other. And as I sat there, Contemplating what I'd discovered, I realized that this wasn't just about Chris's hidden life. It was about the hidden cracks in our family, the things we refused to face. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront the truth, whatever it was. Would this discovery of Chris's dance lead to healing, or would it break us apart further? There were too many unanswered questions, too many secrets buried beneath the surface. But for now, all I could do was hold onto the knowledge that I had stumbled upon a hidden world, one that was waiting to reveal itself, piece by piece. I couldn't stop thinking about the video. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chris dancing. His movements were so free, so alive, and yet, I couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. I should have felt proud. After all, he had a talent I never knew existed, but instead, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I had never once thought to look for something like this. I hadn't known him at all. The weight of it all sat heavy on my chest. I kept replaying that moment over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was this something he had been doing for a long time? How did I not notice? More importantly, why had he kept it from me? The secrecy felt like a wound I didn't know how to heal. Maybe I had been too busy with my own life, too distracted by the tension in my marriage, that I missed the signs. I thought about all the times I tried to talk to him, only to be met with a wall of silence. Now I realized that wall wasn't just a teenager's typical rebellion. It was something deeper, something hidden. I sat in his room, staring at the screen, my fingers hovering over the mouse. The video played in a loop, as if mocking me for not understanding. How could he hide something like this from me? I had always prided myself on being a good mother, on knowing my child better than anyone else. And yet here I was, discovering a part of him that had been completely out of my reach. I felt lost. My mind wandered, wondering if it was connected to something more. I thought of my husband's late-night absences, the unexplained phone calls, the coldness between us. Was this a cry for help, a sign of emotional turmoil? Was Chris trying to escape from a family that seemed to be falling apart? The parallels were uncanny. I couldn't help but wonder if this dance, this hidden life, was his way of dealing with the same emotional distance I was feeling in my. I couldn't wait any longer. The uncertainty, the confusion, it had to stop. I had to talk to Chris. I knew confronting him was risky, but I couldn't live with the tension, the secret that lay between us. He needed to know that I wasn't angry, that I didn't want to invade his privacy. But at the same time, I couldn't just ignore what I had discovered. I had seen his dance, felt the raw emotion in his movements, and yet, I was more concerned about why he had kept it hidden. It felt like an admission of something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. The decision to confront him wasn't easy. My heart raced with the thought of opening this door, and I kept asking myself, what if this drives him further away? But deep down, I knew I couldn't let this fester. If I didn't address it now, I'd risk losing him, losing the connection we had left. The secrets we kept from each other were already tearing apart the fabric of our family. If we didn't speak openly, we'd keep drifting further into isolation. When he came home that evening, the air felt thick. I couldn't even look at him without feeling the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. He knew something was off. I could see it in his eyes. He avoided looking at me, his gaze darting nervously as he moved around the room. But I couldn't let him retreat. I couldn't let him hide behind that wall any longer. "Chris," I said, my voice steady, but tinged with uncertainty. "We need to talk." He stopped in his tracks, and for a moment, I saw that flash of vulnerability. It was subtle, but it was there. He knew this conversation was coming, even if he didn't want it. He hesitated before turning toward me, his shoulders tense, his posture stiff. He knew I had seen the video. I don't know what you saw," he started, his words stumbling over each other, but I interrupted him. "I saw everything. The dancing. The video." I let the words hang there, watching his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. He was a kid, barely starting to figure himself out, and yet here he was, caught between wanting to hide and needing to speak his truth. "I didn't want you to know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I didn't think you'd understand. It's mine. My thing. I didn't want to share it." I could hear the shame in his words, and it broke my heart. I wanted to reach out, tell him it was okay, but I didn't know if that would sound like I was just excusing his secrecy. What bothered me wasn't the dancing itself, but the fact that he felt so disconnected from us, so isolated in his own world. I didn't know how to respond at first. His words hit harder than I expected. "Why didn't you trust me enough to share it?" I asked, feeling the sting of his silence. I could see that he was struggling with his answer, unsure of how to explain something that felt so personal. His eyes darted around, avoiding mine. "I didn't think you'd understand," he repeated, as though that explained everything. But it didn't. It didn't explain the distance, the silence that had become a wall between us. I realized then that this wasn't just about his dance. It was about how disconnected we had all become. How little we truly knew about each other. As much as I wanted to blame him, I knew I had failed too. I hadn't noticed the signs, hadn't tried to understand why he pulled away. We both had our secrets. I didn't know how to tell him that I understood, that it wasn't the dance that hurt me, it was the way he felt the need to hide it, the way we had both stopped talking to each other. It wasn't just about what he was doing, it was about the emotional distance that had formed over time. "I wish you'd let me in," I said quietly, the words feeling like a confession. "I didn't know you felt this way, Chris. We've all been keeping things from each other. Your dad, me, you. It's tearing us apart." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of understanding. Maybe he didn't fully get it, but he could see the hurt in my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. I didn't want apologies. I wanted a bridge between us. I wanted the truth to come out, to stop hiding. "I didn't mean to shut you out," he added, his voice breaking. "I just didn't know how to talk about it." And there it was, the unspoken truth. Neither of us knew how to talk about the things that really mattered. We had spent too many years avoiding the hard conversations, letting the small wounds fester until they became too big to ignore. "I get it," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. But it felt like we were finally getting somewhere. There was no magic solution, no instant fix. It wasn't just about Chris's dance or my marriage anymore. It was about the breakdown of communication, the failure to be honest with each other. I knew this conversation was just the beginning. We had a lot of work ahead of us. But as we stood there, in that awkward silence, I felt a small shift. A crack in the wall. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect. Maybe we couldn't erase the mistakes we had made. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally being real with each other. That, at least, was something to hold on to. The conversation with Chris left me with a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. We had opened a door that had been shut for far too long, but what lay on the other side? Was this a turning point for our family, or had we just scratched the surface of deeper problems? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Later that evening, as Chris went to his room, I found myself standing in the hallway, grappling with everything that had unfolded. The emotional distance between us was clearer than ever, but I wasn't just thinking about Chris. I was thinking about my marriage, the lies, the secrets, the things I had ignored. For years, I had brushed aside the growing tension with my husband, assuming things would fix themselves. But now, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The issues in our family went far deeper than Chris's dance. It was about trust, about feeling seen, and more than anything, it was about all the things we had stopped saying to each other. I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed to talk to my husband, even if I was terrified of the conversation that awaited us. The truth was, I didn't know how much longer I could pretend I didn't know what was happening. The late nights, the phone calls, the emotional distance, it wasn't just a phase. I had known for a while, but I hadn't been ready to face it. But tonight, I knew I had no choice. When he came home, I didn't waste time. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. He paused, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and something else. Guilt, perhaps. For a moment, there was a silence between us, thick and uncomfortable. I had no idea how this conversation would go, but I couldn't back down now. He had been hiding something from me, just like I had been hiding things from him. It was time for the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "What's going on?" he asked, though I could tell he already knew. He must have sensed it, felt the shift in the air. But even then, he didn't seem ready to confront it. He had always been good at avoiding the hard conversations. But this time, I wasn't going to let him. "I know," I said simply. The words felt heavy, but they had to be said. "I know about the late nights. The phone calls. The distance. I know something's been going on, and I can't pretend I don't see it anymore." His face paled slightly and